this is kind of abstract talk. I want to do this one. It didn't come together as well as I'd hoped, so it's going to be a little incoherent. I'm sorry about that. I think it's something we need to talk about. And this relates to actually a couple of previous talks. We talked about controlling traffic server. So this is me. I'm officially retired now. I don't know why I'm here working for free, but that's just how I roll. And I'm on AMC on Slack for anyone who didn't know.
When you say work, that's loosely defined, right?
I do traffic server stuff. You can define whether that's actually work. So of course, if you have traffic server, the base behavior can never be completely generic or automatic. You have to always tune it for local systems, local conditions. So how do we do that? What are the ways you can do that? What mix should we try to push forward in traffic server? All right, so how do we dominate ATS? So there's a couple of things here. I've actually spent quite a lot of time thinking about this over the last few years. So for global consistent behavior, then what you want is a setting. It's a little knob that you turn to turn off. So here's the via header. You want via headers on or off, right? You don't want anything more complex than a little knob that says on, off, right? Just some settings config. Where the root problem, in my opinion, comes in is when we want conditional behavior. That's what makes things complex. That's where stuff starts to break. You have to say, so here's an example of slow logging. So in traffic server, you say slow logging if the transaction latency is more than 10 milliseconds, log it. That's conditional. So the issue you have is, well, what feature are you checking? How do you specify values to check on that? How do you, what kind of checks can you do? This says, well, we're hardwired to GTMS and we're hardwired to greater than, and you don't get any choice about that. Okay, so we're going to talk about that again later. But those are key questions. These are, I think, where the real problems come up is how do you satisfy these requirements? How do you deal with these issues? So we have a bunch of different mechanisms that we use. And always you're balancing convenience with flexibility, right? There is no, this is the best. It depends on a lot of things. Again, for like the global settings, you want to optimize for convenience, have just a knob you turn on. Other things, you need the flexibility, which brings complexity and pain. But if you want to do it, you have to do it. There's just not an option about that. And scale makes a difference. If you, only have one application at LinkedIn and you want to remap for that, you should just write the remap, right? Nobody cares, right? When you have 500, that's very different, right? That's one of the things you talk about in scale. When you start having lots and lots of different things you want to do. I've divided this into three types of things. So it's the settings, and that's where you have some place you can put a value, and that controls behavior. We're going to talk about configuration, where you have some sort of structured data that controls the behavior. And finally, you have plugins, right, which is just Turing complete code, and you can do anything you like. So for settings, those are simple. They're easy to use. Where these start failing is, again, with scale, when you start having, well, there's some other condition. What if it's less than this? What if I want to check the IP address? What if I want to do a bunch of other things? And you end up, and traffic server certainly has this problem. We have a whole bunch of these weird records config things that are really look like settings, but are really conditional operations, and they become hard to understand. And there's no end to how many you're going to add. There's always another condition. There's always another check you want to do. So once you have 10,000 different settings, it's simply unusable. That's not going to work, right? And that's another aspect of scale, right? So then we talk about configuration. Now this is the scripting, and we're going to divide this again into two subparts. One is what I call policy, and this IP allow is an example of that. It's where you have a data flow style model. You say, here's a description of the overall behavior. You figure out what to actually do at runtime, right? So in IP allow, you don't say check this, check that. You say for these addresses do this, for those addresses do that. SNI routing is another example of policy-oriented one. Then there's an imperative style. I'm going to call these scripts, right? So transaction box is the best example of an imperative model. You say, fetch this value out of the transaction, check it in this way against this other value, and then do this thing. So it's much more like a programming language. You specify the check, you specify what values, you specify what the action is. So policy is generally more convenient if you can make it work. It often suffers from the same limitations as settings in that, for again, IP allow, we'll take the example. You say, here's the value, here's the feature you're going to check against. And here are the values you can have for it. Here's a limited set of actions you can have. So it's highly specialized. It's really convenient. If all you want to do is do IP-based ACL, it's great. When you do something more complex, you can't break out of the model. And I'm going to, yes.
You say it's less flexible. I guess it depends what you mean by flexible, right? And how I implement it, it's more flexible, right?
Yeah. I'm talking about from the user point of view.
In what you can express.
Yes. Right. So if you're an IP allow, it's very convenient, but it's not flexible. So you can't say, oh, for this one, I also want to do this other tag on it, right? Or we were talking last night about the SNI config stuff, right? You can't say, don't tunnel it all, just drop it. You have to change that. So you have these limitations. Yeah, this is one of the things I really didn't like about Envoy. I looked at Envoy config. I hate to be biased there, but it was just the policy stuff just seemed so wacky to me. I just thought it was crazy. So I actually looked around some other practices, and so you generally tend to see a lot more scripting. You see some policy for some limited cases, but if you look around, scripting seems to be much more prevalent. All right, and finally we have plugins, and I'm gonna skip over this slide a little bit because we just had two talks about that, right? If you have a plugin, it's the ultimate cost, the ultimate flexibility, because you can do anything in the plugin, right? If you have WAS, you can load arbitrary libraries, you can execute them. There's no limit. However, over the last few years, I'd say like 4 to 5 years, my personal experience has been a lot of pushback against plugins for some of the reasons that were mentioned in the last talk, and what the question came up about crashing and whatnot. Plugins, they're expensive to write because you have limited sets of people who can actually write them. You have to maintain them. They're time consuming to do. And I'm just going to be a jerk here and say, looking at the plugin code, it apparently is very, very difficult to write performant plugin code in C++. People just do things that just don't scale well. And you have to, and it's not, how can I express this? It's not that say, I'm going to write inefficient code. It's that you have to have a lot of state knowledge and expertise to write performant code. Writing that is hard. It's a different skill. You have to write your code in a different way, right? It's not just something that just happens. It's a very deliberate effort. And I'm going to talk tomorrow about some of the efforts I've made in that regard. Anyway, however, we're never going to get rid of plugins. There's always going to be something that's not in your script, that's very, locally centric. And so you're going to have some plugins. So we're going to do a mix of those. So some of the issues you come up when you do this kind of thing, one is performance at scale. So this is something I'm actually working on now, is if I've got 10,000 strings and I want to match against them, I want to do that fast. So if it's this string, else if it's this string, else if it's this string, that's not going to scale. That's going to, you're doomed. Ain't going to work. But again, that's a scale thing. If you have 10 strings, then really it's not a problem. Right? It's when you get into the scale. And we've all talked about how we have thousands, if not tens of thousands of remap rules. So 10,000 is a reasonable scale number for actual production. One of the things with script is you can try to optimize them. That's easier to do than trying to optimize Turing complete languages. No one here, I think, has written any part of the C++ compiler that does C++ code optimizations, and we're not going to. You can try to hope for that, but that's kind of difficult. And we talked about that. We talked about writing non-performant plugins. And I'm sorry, Kip, I looked at yours and it was non-performant. And WASM doesn't save you from that, right? It doesn't. It's not something that it helps you with. So yeah, one of the things that LibSwat came out of was working with Transaction Box and trying to do better on this, trying to make this easier to do. But it's never going to be easy, right? That's just not going to happen. So we have the whole maintenance issue. We talked about this in some of the earlier talks too. And this isn't just for plugins. Configurations, if you're doing script or policy, have to maintain. There's changes to them all the time in any sort of real production. So everything is changing all the time. The settings are one of the few things that tend not to change. You generally just you use VIA or you don't. You just set those. So you have to look at pre-deployment validation. That's a bit easier. The plugins are riskier, more powerful. So one of the things you're talking about are crashes, whatnot. If we have a script that's built into traffic server, it can be tested by everyone, validated by everyone. It'll just crash a lot less than a plugin that only you wrote and then only your corporation runs. So that's a big issue. We have extensibility. And this is another scale issue. For settings, this is kind of hard. There's a limited number of knobs you can put in there, and it gets kind of ugly later. With scripting, what you'd like to do is you have to have the scripting implementation, make it easy to add new directives, new conditions, new features. I'm sorry, by feature, I mean something you extract out of the transaction. So because someone's always going to ask for, oh, I would like to look at this, right? I'd like to look at the SNI name. I'd like to look at this HTTP2 metadata value. So you'd really want the implementation to let you add things easily, right? So that's a key feature. Policy, that doesn't really come up. The policy limitations are, well, you're just limited, and that's what you get. This really comes up much more with both scripting and plugins. And yeah, Kit was just talking about that. We're going to have to add some new API for the plugins to fully conform to the WASM spec, right? I don't think it'll be too hard, but again, you have to have a system where you can continually do this because new stuff is just always going to come up. And then we asked about one of the things I really favor here is generic mechanisms. So I like to separate like feature extraction from checking. Right, so policy tends to mix those together. Again, with IPLL, you say this is the feature and here's how you check it. I like to go more with, and this is something you get out of plugins, to say there's something I do to get the feature value, and there's something else I do to check on it, and there's something else I do to act on it. The UTR basically is very close to that too, right? There's something that says, there's a thing that says, get me if it's mobile. There's a thing that says, check if it's mobile, and there's a thing that says, do this in that case. And so you've split those apart. So I think we need to look, that needs to be something that I think we really want to keep in any sort of ATS core stuff. All right. It's also nice to be able to have additional actions. This is actually less important, although it should still be doable. And this issue that came up, where's Evil Cow? Is he here today?
He's remote.
He's remote. So yeah, he was asking me about this, and this is a serious issue we need to talk about is how many errors, how much tolerant errors should you be when you load the configs? So for instance, records config always just loads unless it's just completely broken. And it gives you a bunch of warnings to say, hey, I don't understand these settings. So transaction box on the other end, it is viciously pedantic. It says if a single thing I don't understand, you lose, I'm not running, or I'm not reloading. So we have to think, is there a middle ground there? One of the things I've seen is that I see these records config warnings that are literally years old, back from version 5, and they still haven't been fixed. And the problem you have is that if you have any of these errors, your config is not doing what you think it is, right? It is misbehaving in some way, guaranteed. On the other hand, having to get this all perfectly shipped out is a pain too. Evan, can you actually say something?
Yeah, I can.
So this is for you. I mean, what do you think? I want to hear an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I prefer just complete failure and then pointing to, hey, this was the issue.
Oh, okay. Then why were you whining at me?
It might have not been me. That might have been Jonathan.
I thought it was you. Anyway, we should need to say, should we have yet a meta configuration to say how many errors are tolerated? But this is an issue that's going to come up, and I'm of the school that it needs to be perfect, just like a compiler, so that you know that what you put out there is what's actually happening.
When it comes to tolerance, the big thing from my perspective as an operator is being able to verify before issuing changes into the field that those changes are not going to cause it to just summarily fail in some way. So I like.
Okay, wait, stop.
Okay.
Let's define fail. There's two types of fail. One fail is I don't reload your config and I ignore it. The other is traffic gets screwed up.
Fail to reload.
Okay.
Fail to reload, because that is a state where we've got shared operators moving different pieces at the same time. And so if something happens with one person making one change, everybody has to stop and wait for that person to fix it. Because each remap line or config file isn't atomic. everything works as a big unit. And so the questions earlier around, particularly transaction box, trying to be able to verify configs in a way before they're issued, so that way independent operators don't have to make that global statement of everybody get back. I got to go fix what I broke in the reload.
All right. Yeah, I have to think about that. I mean, what do you do about when you have these errors and no one looks at the warnings and they sit there for a couple of years? Or you have fixes around that?
I mean, we've got alarms that go off like crazy if the reload fails.
Well, I mean, suppose we set it so it ignores the errors and just reloads anyway, and then you have these errors. Are those detectable?
There are things that we do try to keep tabs on, and certain ones we do pay more attention to than others. But the tricky part becomes basically some warnings are actionable, some are not. And basically if the reload fails, that's something we know we definitively must go take action. Whereas when it comes to bad URL sig requests, right? Sure, that's interesting to know, and it's good from a troubleshooting perspective if somebody's saying their stuff doesn't, they can't pass traffic the way they think. But it's not everybody stop what you're doing and go fix this. So different warnings are more complicated, and because there's no standardized formatting of any kind of output realistically, that makes mining specific errors more labor intensive, and you must basically have a working example to go from. Because if I'm reading the diags log, then that's more complicated to parse.
All right, hold on. I actually want to make a note on that. Because that's actually a real issue. Right, you'd like to.
That's not even formatting though. It could be just like we don't do it, like we don't make it easy for helper applications to learn that there are these error messages.
How would you do that other than put it in the log? That's my problem.
Yeah.
Thanks, Miles.
Well done.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, right? I'm not down in the bowels of the code of ATS, but it's my general understanding that logging is effectively just a printf statement that you can do whatever you want with.
Yes, but there's things you can do, and if we would like to say as a community, no, that's an important issue that your formatting should be consistent. So one thing we could do is if you want to complain about transaction box formatting needs, then ping and I'll try to get that fixed, at least set an example.
Right. And I mean, there's another aspect of it is too, like in some of the applications that I write, I use the loggers tool to be able to provide structured logs. That still leaves it up to the implementer to define what that structure is, but it's at least something I can export as JSON or something like that, so that more advanced tooling doesn't have to apply regexes all over the place. The implementer still gets to define the structure, but it's at least more machine parsable.
Yeah, I know when we did the info sector work back 10 or 2 years ago, Susan and I, we had this issue. One of the things we did was we made sure that every error message or warning message issued had a unique ID attached to it.
And that's
a numeric
helpful.
ID. And so that if you saw an error message and you look at the numeric ID, you could tell exactly which line in the code had the problem. So we might look that might be useful to do, and then see if you can do some automatic way, because that would be pretty machine parsable, right? You just say the number is supposed to be here. I'll look it up, and that tells me what I need to know. All right. Yeah. So how much time do I have?
You know, my time too.
We're over, but you know what? You can always go.
Yeah, I don't have a lot more material, so I'll finish up.
Leif can always go after lunch.
So we tried the Lua config. Anyone here remember doing Lua config for configuration? Yeah. So that did not end well. And we have lots of different opinions about why. I think some of it was the Turing completeness of it. I honestly think that if you're doing any scripting, you really want to avoid Turing completeness, because then you're buying all the pain of a plugin without the power of a plugin. Right? You want that's a whole class of problems that simply can't occur anymore. And if you really need that power, then you should be writing a plugin. Yeah, there was limitations. I know Leif was asking about that. It was kind of expensive to have all the Lua states floating around. There were limited numbers of them. We had a big thing when we talked. One of the reasons I did talk about scripting versus policy is this was a big issue with the Lua config. Some things were scripting and some things were policy, and we never really got that settled. So that was a serious problem. So where do you want to go in the future? So I have my opinions. Really, this is a talk to lay out what people need to be thinking about, because this is becoming more of an issue, the ability to configure ATS, and we need to start getting community consensus on where we want to go. So I'm trying to lay out what are the important issues we have to think about.
There is another talk on that topic though,
Okay, then I'm just going to finish up quickly here.
your talk.
Well, it's not a talk, it's more of a discussion.
Right.
but
So this is a setup for that then.
Yes.
Yeah, but don't go way into the details maybe.
I don't know.
Well, I'm about to finish up. I'm about 2 more minutes here. So, we have this version of the YAML thing that is actually still being worked on. I know Damien's working on records.config right now. Transaction boxes, I still expect to eventually put into the core as base configuration of traffic server. So we're working on that, and the parent selection strategy is another place where there's active work being done on converting to YAML. So one of my things is I want to push a lot more, to have a lot more config versus plugins. As I said, we're not going to get rid of plugins. That's not possible, but I'd like to have a lot more power in the base config that you don't have to write them. And I'll talk about that more then. And one of the things we're also working on currently is coordination between scripts and plugins. Kevin mentioned that during his talk. I'd like to make that much more formal in the core. Essentially, what it would go down to is having named variables that you can access from a plugin or from a configuration script that you can set with a limited set of types and reasonable set of types. So that I can say, I'm going to have a variable named Leif's adder, and I'll set an IP address in it to say never go there. Right, and I can have a config that sets that, or a plugin that pulls it out, and then you can look at it. And as again, Kevin can test, that's a really powerful little tool. It sounds like not much, but it can. There's some really cool things that you can fall out from that. Anyway, that's about it. Setting up for the talk tomorrow.
There's another dimension, is there? I mean, traditionally, ATS is very configured, very file oriented, kind of get your config at the start of time, there you are. There's also a dimension of changing your config at runtime, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I should have mentioned that. I guess I didn't, because to me, you should always just be able to reloadable. If it is physically possible to
Well,
reload.
not even going through a file, but like I think the envoy style is more like you're going through control channel, right?
No, that's a lie. What actually happens there, I actually looked this up when I was doing the research, is basically the only difference is you don't open a file. The thing shows up in a RPC message, but the format is identical to the file. You're really just sending files over to gRPC. And fine, yeah, we can do that too. It's just not, it's if you have this other stuff, that's not very complex, right? You just, here's the file, load it.
So it's always a replacement, it's not an update?
That's my understanding, yes. So, discovery is the same thing, right? You have some minimal thing, you go out and you ask, and it hands you the configs to say, just replace your current configs with these configs. And that's not a big technological hurdle, in my opinion. Incremental change is hard. That's why I made Damien do the records.config, because people want traffic and CTL to make incremental changes. And that's hard. Thanks, Damien. Love. All right.
I have one question, but we can maybe defer till tomorrow too. I still have the beef of transaction box replacing remap the way you did it. And I don't know where we are with that, but we can maybe discuss that tomorrow.
We can go ahead and discuss that. Yeah, I have finally designed the implicit stream acceleration stuff. I need to start working on that. Damien, of course, love Damien. Gave me a nice start on that, so I'm actually working on that. Aviatrix was asking me to do some work in there, so I'm going to get that done. In that case, if you have a big list, it'll just automatically accelerate that for you. So if you want to just have a big list of all your URLs, you just do that.
But you're still replacing remap or config with this?
Yeah.
So
Well,
how-
we'll talk about that. Let's talk about that tomorrow.
Right, so the question that I have is how do you do a remap plugin for that, for this infrastructure?
You would,
So we can't use remap plugins anymore. That's probably a deal breaker for almost everyone.
well, I mean, we could put adapters in. I hate Remap, sorry, but
No, I get that, but I mean, the migration from what you have to transaction box becomes near impossible.
all right, well, we can look at that. We can always put a shim in to say, okay, well, I'll pretend there's a remap phase and I'll call you.
So you would essentially you would write plugins for transaction box essentially.
Essentially, but I mean, if transaction box migrates into the core, then you're just writing for traffic server.
Maybe related to that, I mean, one thing that's kind of clear from this talk, you acknowledge that there's a need for scripting. There's a knowledge for the need for.
Well, I wrote transaction box.
Yeah,
Well, no, it's
transaction box
is scripting.
with it.
That's scripting. Transaction box is scripting.
Well, you talked about, well, there'll always be a need for plugins.
Yes.
That have ad hoc needs,
Yes,
like that LinkedIn has, or Yahoo has, or something that aren't generic.
that aren't sufficiently generic to the, yeah.
So this really, there's still, just to make this explicit, there's still a lot of value in something like proxy WAS and plugins there because they can fill.
Oh, yeah, we're absolutely, that's going to be very handy. No doubt about that. Yeah, plugins
Yeah.
are not going away.
And related to what Leif is saying, there'll still be a need for like remap plugins that you want to call that have that logic. Right?
I think that the functionality can be done other ways, but I mean, let's look at LinkedIn. They're getting rid of remap config too.
They're using remap plugins, right?
For now, but their whole goal is to eventually completely skip the remap phase entirely and just not have anything there. Right. And I think that's the good direction. All right, I'm gonna cut it off. We'll have a talk tomorrow and we can actually discuss this. So hopefully this is a good setup for what we want to talk about there. Thank you.